Yeah, good afternoon everybody. I welcome you to the lunch talk of Dr. ASHFORD. I'm very happy you are here. You're guiding the course of us, which is about the unhuman, and you will tell me something about your work. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a rather formal paper that I wrote last year in response to academic settings that wanted me to talk about a book that I published the fall before at an exhibition in Graz. The book is in the library. So it's kind of a condensation of some of the practical and conceptual concerns that I've had over the past 30 years, but it tries to organize it around some historical demands that that I feel. So I apologize in advance for its formality, but hopefully I can read through it legibly with some clear sense of an author, so then there can be like a response and we can have a more open conversation that seems more suitable to this location, because after being here for only 2 days, there is a sense of generous intellectual interaction that I have to say I find quite unique, and I want to thank Hildegunn for inviting me and for making that context working. So thank you. Okay, this talk is called The Non-Human Being. Quote, "A profane error is compromised as soon as its heavenly appeal to God and country, its oratio pro aris et focus, has been refuted. The human, who before looked for a superhuman being in the fantastic reality of heaven and found nothing there but the reflection of himself, can no longer feel disposed to find a mere appearance of herself and will be faced with an unmaking, where the human seeks and must seek his or her true reality as a non-human being." This is Karl Marx in 1844 in his book, The Introduction to a Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. Lately, I've been starting all my talks with the same image. This is from Bernard Lebouvier de Fontenelle's book, Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds. It's the frontispiece. It's a book of fictitious conversations about the scientific discoveries of the time, the late Enlightenment, their uses, their virtues. In it, the seducer of a young marquise finds himself in an impossible competition with her true love, the imagined form of the cosmos. In other words, she is more in love with science than she is in love with the idea of a man. And here you can see the couple together in amorous conversation or seduction under the pure fabulous organization of the universe. I want to present it as a kind of visual sign for the idea that any confusion between abstract signs for the world and identifications we have with each other that we experience today is a continuation of a proposal that's actually quite old. One that posits the opposition between the abstract and the concrete, or between the universal and the particular. And it can be posited in the daily occurrences of love and sociality that even today produce public life. Sorry. For this talk, I thought I would begin with past propositions from my older work that haunt the work that I've been doing recently. Exhibition and public production based on particular and political urgency, and organize these memories and the frustrations they produce into the present, into a set of problems that might bring us all to some questions, and maybe it will help me, because in a way, that is my present and perhaps somewhat neurotic condition, repeating the questions, repeating them again and again, the past failures that produce different forms in order to understand them. Most of my younger artistic life was centered on what we once called institutional or social practices. producing exhibitions and public projects organized around and often in response to the political reality of the time. This work was purposefully designed to be in a critical replacing role with the infrastructures that build that reality: the museum, the school, and the street. By far the largest component of my history at that time was group material, an intimate collaboration of artists that I joined at its emergence in a shared commitment of a group of people for making new autonomous zones for artworks. And this, of course, is in the time of 80s expressionistic Marxismo and the economic privatization of the invention of neoliberalism. Group material was a collaboration that over the next 15 or so years grew to a quite specific practice of presenting the exhibition and display of the artwork as a form in itself, organizing the design, discourse, and social forces that surround the display of art as a kind of artistic medium. Through most of its years, group material was a collaborative of changing personnel, remaining quite small and always dedicated to the notion that the dislocation of art back into the world and the displacement of the museum into the street might actually change the conditions for how art is understood. For some members over this period of time, the work we did in museums in the street became our principal practice. But at the same time, for many of us, we always did work on an individual level. In those days, much of my creative life was centered on teaching, with a peripheral involvement in the making of discrete objects, usually paintings, that tried to reiterate and model my experiences in art and activism through the arrangement of simple forms. Originating in the experience of the natural environment, especially the night sky, which is the first painting I showed you, these pictures developed quickly into schematic pictures that tried to make order from the memories, meetings, and social interactions that made up both my ideational fantasies and the daily life of their expressions. Drawn in an overly disordered geometry, composed as a personal diagram that would depict the paradoxes of these intersubjective experiences, the social practices of negotiation, the emotional life of the classroom where I taught, identification, power, and conflict. Particularly conflict in what it means to display and arrange an exhibition, to try to create linear or literal meaning. At times, the paintings that I was making worked classically in a kind of a modernistic way, in which the painting surface becomes no longer the analog to visual experience of nature or reality, but instead the picture becomes an operational process, picturing how things happen instead of picturing the things themselves. At other times, they functioned as direct translations, reworking complex visual perception into simpler images. Throughout this time, I was fascinated with the shifting effect of space and time in institutional replanning, the unconscious reorganization of memories in and out of time, and how they are evoked publicly for audiences and citizens as part of a political process. In a very sentimental way, these kind of operational maps or diagrams were at first for me addressed to the failure of ethical orientations in presenting art, ways to remove myself from the utilitarian idea of an exhibition serving a political program, and trying to find an appreciation for a broader form of social investment, how to make the administration of experience more detached, a horizon of what I would want outside of organization. But once underway, imagery withdrawn into abstraction suggested another problem with the engagement in the sphere of politics, something unleashed from any strict coherence between subject and object. Once a social process was presented as simply a set of colors, the possible positions and agency of my subjection in the world seemed also to fraction, to become, in a sense, to decompose. In other words, once you make a diagram of something that removes it from the specific agencies and contingencies of how we work in the world, your own relationship to those contingencies also then becomes abstract, or can be seen as abstract, and therefore in a kind of way drifts away from the real work of everyday life. And this could mean, I hoped, that the life of feelings that I experience internally, a life that we all theoretically share as we develop personalities and character and learn how to relate to other people, could in a sense be the places through which we disavow rationality. But as we know, the idea of one's nature, or one's true nature, as distinct from the stories, images, and references that we describe, or at worst are dictated onto us by others, this world of experiences is in fact a convenient fiction, a kind of a conceit that allows the world to slip away from the ego. Certainly, there is both a psychological and philosophical contradiction to the notion that the world we make around us, the world we produce, is a barrier to the understanding of the self. Because quite problematically, if we made this world, why can't it describe us? But nonetheless, and rarely shared, is the sense that we all have of never truly being ourselves in the world, never being what we expect, never really the same as others, never allowed to fully possess ourselves in the world, always in a state of potential loss. And we know from Marx's contribution that I cited at my beginning here, the struggle against the illusions and the ideologies of identity are only adolescently utopian when the proposal leaves the pillars of the house of ideology still standing, which they do. Most of us as artists keep the house standing. We work in a situation in which the organization of the lives of our audiences and the economies that produce it are reproduced. Group Material's notion of an ongoing public design meant that we could visibly position human assembly as a struggle that never ends. Founded on the generative notion of montage, the showing of art with other artifacts of material culture could become a larger template for the social forum, for the parliament, for the agora, turning the gallery into a dialogic process that rejects the false consensus of pluralism and replaces it with a temporary sense of anxiety, showing how forms are subject to changing content and change each other in juxtaposition. Group Material's inventions, and it's nice having an artistic practice that's not you, because you can speak about it as an it rather than a me. Group Material's inventions of display accelerated democracy's unpredictability in an immediate location and made that inclusivity into an imagined shape through exhibition design. A shape that is always irregular and fluctuating, an abstract and affecting proposal for the social production of life that is actually rarely applied to life. That is, that things change as you walk through time and space. Although often working as an activist tool and having a real political function, many Group Material projects actually did produce real politics and real agency. Something that, although they actually did, in the end, at this point in my life now, I'm leaving the text a bit, I'm more concentrated on the abstract proposal. Because this shape is also an aesthetic invention that works without a real function, works outside of utility. It's something that addresses life's practical dilemma, with the idea of an archive always being rearranged, always being misrecognized, a timeline that could be read backwards, a topography relabeled with aimlessness, certainty replaced by associations, associations that people could experience together and design themselves. But then, what is the nature of this irregular shape, that I'm defining as group material as social invention. And if it is abstract, it must be then based in withdrawal from the real. If it's withdrawn, what does it remove itself from? What is it trying to show without depicting it? That society is better off assumed than remade? This is a difficult proposal because it's the underlying process of abstraction, a reduction of the over-decorated into that which is yet to be filled, something that is overly represented into something that is empty. In many ways, the work of institutional critique that I and others was involved in was one that presented itself against this unclear abstract ideas, against the mystifying formalism that we were asked to inherit in the 1980s from expressionism and formalism as young artists. Particularly though, I gotta finish the quotes. Particularly though, there was, for me, a betrayal of what abstraction provided was a betrayal of the determining effect of time in the rational world, freeing a viewer or a producer of art into a non-objective practice. As non-objective practices so often can, freeing us from time's investment in progress, freeing us even from the values associated with progress itself, shifting insistence from the timely social and political issues of a period to a reflective time, a time in which experiences are always in a state of anticipation, seeing the past as always already in the present. In other words, when you were in a group material show and you were comparing historical archival documents with contemporary objects produced by artists of that time, and also with objects that would not necessarily be understood as having the aura or the value of art, the relationship between your sense of appreciation or dislocation into art would have to find itself shifting in a sense out of what you would normally know as history, and therefore would not necessarily see that artwork as being part of a condition of looking towards progress. So often in a group material show, an advertisement for a box of cereal would be misunderstood as an artwork. An artwork of 50 years ago would be misunderstood as having happened in the present, and something in the present would appear to be antique. These paintings are called Six Movements in 1967. And they're a series of small tempera compositions put together with 6 photographs of political manifestations in the street. To try to see them, my goal was to try to see the grid that surrounds each photograph as a conditioning of subjective experience into an objective form that could be remeasured in relationship to a memory of a political event. Identification with the demonstrations documented in the photos impressed upon me a color condition of both hope and death, in which variations on a dark blue would be organized around the activities of those involved. Not to be too associational, but in a sense it's the blue of the sky, which is like a hopeful blue, and the blue of the corpse. They are painted over and over again in an attempt to excessively or magically include what might have happened in the actual event that's being documented, or what does happen every time we return to activity. There's something important to me about looking at a painting as a kind of varying notation, as a sort of script that you're reading over and over again, like re-looking through a photo album as a place where you are reading someone else's or something else's experiences. To articulate what is in the past does not mean to recognize how it really was. It means to take control of a memory as it flashes in a moment of danger. For historical materialism, it is a question of holding fast to the picture of the past just as if it had unexpectedly thrust itself in a moment of danger on the historical subject. That's Walter Benjamin on the concept of history. Danger for me has something to do with the interest that I have in trying to reorganize time through abstraction. In danger, society can be seen as both less and more than its organization. In times of emergency, or in times of catastrophe, society is often replaced by sociability. People who don't necessarily come to the aid of each other come to the aid of each other, for instance. I think maybe this is meaningful in relationship to the abstract practices that I'm involved in, because it suggests a breaking down those events under emergency, suggests breaking down the dividing line between subjective emotion and the supposed objective realities of history. But the true formal and physical, I'm sorry, I skipped something. Encountering the conflict between these invented memories and historical facts is equivalent in a way to viewing oneself through a variety of bodies in positions of address and identification, looking toward another's eyes, looking toward their eyes as a position through which to look back. The Renaissance notion of perspectival view, that one can actually occupy the sight of another, and through that position, established by the work of art, come to a context of transubstantiation, where you in a sense become the other person, is an idea of encountering someone previously unknown. But the true formal and physical presence of a stranger is actually kind of more difficult for us today to discuss than through those traditional perspectival ideas of being in someone. In a way, today's problem suggests a different kind of identification, something that suggests even perhaps a kind of a violence that might be positive, but replacing of identities that were given to us by power. The idea of feeling into another person, or feeling in an object that one previously understands as outside of the self, seems to me key to how we might understand abstraction as a value in visualizing sociality. Its theorization was part of the formation of an expressive aesthetics, first proposed by the 19th century psychologist Theodore Lipps, as I understand it through the almost non-existent English translations of his work, and then picked up by the philosopher Wilhelm Boehringer in his essay, Abstraction and Empathy. In this work, Boehringer set out to distinguish the sense that we have of the emotional identification with art subjects by separating the representational schema of art into two opposing camps. One, naturalistic, based in empathy, a fusing of experience with representation to the degree that the human's own experience becomes that of the object beheld. We all know this idea. I feel the lilies in the Monet painting as if they are part of my own identity and experience. His other idea was based on abstraction, that he posited in that time in so-called primitive art. We have to excuse Boehringer because he lived in the 19th century, and his ideas about abstraction were sometimes inappropriately linked to an idea that some parts of the globe were less developed artistically than European parts of the globe. But anyway, the other was based on abstraction, posited in so-called primitive art. This divined a place of removal from these human identification or empathy and implied a new approach to the world that provides only the outlines of felt or natural experiences. This outlined world, this partial world, became for him and other early 20th century Euro-American modernists a site for potential revolution because it showed what art could provide by investing in the position of anxiety with the world. Important to my thinking is the incomplete yet common English translation of this complex term that Boehringer used, and I'm going to mispronounce it, Einfühlung. In English we translated to the word empathy. Boehringer attached Oh, I'm gonna be in Vietnam, sorry. Warringer attached the sense of specificity of the imagery associated with classical art and naturalism to empathy. Opposite to being in something, for me, would be out of it, right? So when he suggests that we recognize ourselves in abstraction differently, he is asking that we are not the self that is feeling the other. I believe he understood something that's actually quite contemporary, that in understanding the other, or in displaying ourselves as understanding the other, we are displacing the other. You know the story. When someone says, oh, I think you have to try to imagine yourself in that other person's shoes, right? That's an act of empathy. But the contemporary question is, when we imagine ourselves in someone else's shoes, where did they go? Did we somehow move them out of the way? Did we make them disappear? Interesting to me is the idea that abstraction could now be understood as a sense that it is in a way in opposition to empathy, that it's a kind of anti-naturalistic identification that's beyond recognition and beyond the need for recognition, and could actually produce a sense of humanity beyond the received definitions of what we are supposed to be. Studio. I'm a little worried about time, so I'm trying to take a little bit out. This project, called Many Readers of One Event, started with a desire that I had to try to create a more theatrical experience of these kind of concerns. It involved making a tableau, a fabrication of multiple points of view on the documentation of a particular emergency, a particular catastrophe, or at least the evidence of this catastrophe that faced me one morning when I was reading the New York Times. I wanted to connect this event with an open-ended analogy of how we respond to other disasters, those that now seem infinitely reorganized for us to becoming part of the ongoing socio-economic sphere of war and deprivation. As an example, if you'd like, I have the New York Times, entire New York Times that I had scanned. It's put up in our room upstairs in our classroom. And if you look back at that newspaper from a position of today, you can see quite clearly how the response to disasters seem overly and infinitely reorganized for us to become ongoing socio-economic participants in the sphere of war and deprivation. But anyway, the documented work that I began with was not easily understood as socially produced. It was a particularly awful experience of a group of parents finding their dead children in a Camden, New Jersey parking lot. In my installation, there is a single news photograph, this one, from the New York Times, of the parents collapsing in each other's arms at this discovery. If you look it up, you can see a lot of images of this whole sort of period of maybe 45 minutes in Camden. It was very richly documented. And this is because the children had been missing for a few days. An assembly, a search party was being assembled. The photographers were there at the assembly of the search party, as they often are. And while people were organizing, someone ran up and said, "I found them." And they were in the trunk of a car, which is in the parking lot where you see, as you see here, where they had accidentally locked themselves in. All the many other photographs in the project that I produced are of actors. Actors reenacting this physical position. Trying in a way to correspond to those reenactments is a series of 18 paintings that from my position in a way that may be quite arbitrary, but hopefully we can discuss it. 18 paintings that explore how abstraction, in juxtaposition with a document, might work together to inform a different kind of human response to sociality. These works embody a way of looking simultaneously at two different kinds of intellectual organization of affect. One identified with the experience in the reenactments, the act of empathy, and the other that is off-center, the paintings, examining the ways in which abstraction might create the possibility for sharing an experience of something that has no reference. Oops. The hut's form, all the work was put inside a small shelter built in a park. The hut's form in isolation as a tool shed is related to the idea that abstraction has a capacity to model things in ways that become difficult for us to instrumentalize, difficult to make into tools, or trying to redefine, in a sense, what the utility of an abstract experience may be. As a cabinet or an aquarium, this glass-fronted house served for me as a way to look at documented facts, to look at them in a sense from a distance, as you would in a museum's display, or a fish inside an aquarium, in which, in some way, these things are supposed to gain command and control of their own world. And I could put them in a place in which the struggle with ideal models of abstract pictures and events could seem to be working their way out on their own. I have now another quote from Barringer that I constructed from different translations. He's sort of disappointing to read in English, so I decided to kind of invent him. It's what he said, but it's my reworkings of a couple of different English translations. The tendency to abstraction is the result of a great inner. The tendency to abstraction is the result of a great inner conflict between man and his surroundings. A feeling of anxiety that can be considered the root of all artistic creation. With the psychological fear of space before the vast, incoherent, bewildering world of phenomena, the case of every human is similar. The rationalistic development of mankind represses that instinctive anxiety, which results from the lost state of being in the world. The possibility of happiness, which is sought through art, does not consist of immersing ourselves in the things of the external world, in self-enjoyment, but in the end, in freeing the things of the outer world from their arbitrariness, from their apparent contingency, immortalizing them by approximating them into abstract forms, and in this way, finding a resting place. Crazy idea, sorry. Finding a resting place for the flight of all phenomena. The strongest impulse we may have might be, as it were, to tear the external object out of the context of nature, out of the endless interplay of existence, to purify it of all dependence on life, all arbitrariness, to make it stable and necessary. How am I doing? Almost done. I'll stop in a sort of arbitrary place. Because we should be done in 45 minutes, yeah?
It's not so strict.
Okay. People in my class have work to do. If empathy is an incomplete stabilization of myself and otherness, abstraction is a resolution that such experience in conflict with the full stability of the object world might become something we could get a handle on. Hence the realization in so many abstract presentations of the potential that the wide breadth of meanings, their multiplicity, or recently in the art world, their relationality, is presented to us as having a more generous kind of self-modeling. If we follow the Latin root of the word abstrahere, which means withdrawal, from which abstraction comes, this relation may be seen as not necessarily isolated, but as vibrating in a space that is just not in the center of things, that is off-center, that is delivered from a distance, from a point of removal. Here, perhaps, in this idea of removal, is a sign of the political potential of abstraction. A statement that demands the reordering of the arbitrariness of the life world we inhabit, and it is by definition a kind of a turning away, a refusal of both nature and the naturalizing effect of power, a betrayal of the rationalization of everyday life. From the outside, such a gesture could seem irrational, or even superstitious, or even quite reactionary in terms of its investment, proposing an inappropriate transformation in its most radical, making objects into forms of life, making things vital, or as Warringer says, giving things vitality. Such animistic transformation certainly proposes both the universe of rebellion from reality, because the things are speaking back to us, and also an opportunity for perversion, because the objects we love no longer fulfill our expectations for how they are formed. It also brings the response that rationalizing and efficiency-minded culture brings to the refusal embedded in us when we treat things as people, or when we treat people as if they are organized differently than authority tells us to organize them. Culture brings to our refusals an answer. We're told that our decisions to not work with the agendas of reality or the expectations of a built society, that shows us to be dysfunctional, to be romantic, or at the very worst, not in control of our appetite. If we present the work of art into the portal, as a portal into the helplessness that we experience in the face of differentiation and appetite, and if we figure out a way to then, in a sense, face them as things that maybe form and can become a political concept, we actually might affect the visual forms that we speak and describe, instead of only addressing the existing spaces of power as they already exist. By linking feelings embedded in artistic experience to abstract forms of discourse and knowledge, by asking audiences to become confused, to have no reference, we are asking them to remake themselves socially in relationship to their affection to others. Do you understand this? Do you know what this is? We're asking them to turn, in a sense, away from the conditions of the organization of artistic meaning that already exist. Paradoxically, and by turning to each other, enter into a state of affection. Paradoxically, affection, like Warringer's abstraction, frees things from the arbitrariness and contingency of power, provides people with an opportunity of withdrawal, and therefore an opportunity for reformation. But I have to admit, at this point in my thinking, I become confused, because by acknowledging affection or love or a connection to others, that idea of communion or the commune suggests a much closer sense of self-enjoyment and empathy than the complex, rigorous sense of anxiety engaged in abstraction. Okay, I'm going to try to skip through, because we're at 45 minutes. But I'll let you see the pictures. Green door, Cornell president. Once somebody tries to become a form that denies this artificially unified and stable individuality, and this is, of course, my Warringer, not necessarily the Warringer that's in the book, the consistency and the implicit nature of helplessness between us might be seen and felt. The anxiety caused by the world could become dissipated through images that are designated as valuable through relationships between people. It's a kind of sociality without a plan. What if behind every abstract room of paintings there was a group of people? a hidden association or constituency, collected in madness, like a family. You know how a family represents madness, right? Collected in madness like a family, collapsing and reorganizing itself according to an unrecognizable kind of politics. Surely this might disorganize the dark, abstract state of affairs we cope with in the civil war waged against us by finance. As human life is imprisoned into the unstable connections built by debt, we could present new entities in the face of such slavery. Perhaps even more unstable by proposing our own individual state of emergencies. This is a state that I think I tried to describe in this last set of paintings and photographs. It's a kind of a more ambivalent effort to try to present individuation or the making of a person as always already in a disaster. Somehow in the face of calamity, we do seem to form our own temporary zones of support. But my interest in this last work that I worked on is that in a way that context of support itself is also subject to another sense of emergency, one that then places the identities and empathies that we might have about the universal helplessness in the face of the world that we all share as something that creates violence. Perhaps this idea of a failure of a generous form of social agency is, in the sense that a success of abstraction made possible in a perverse way. Because the tension between the social and aesthetic practice is only ever material in an institutional setting. And this is what sort of makes us as artists, I think, well, everyone here, in a way, lucky, that because of the institutional settings that, in a sense, design our responses to this anxiety, we always have a context to, in a sense, be authors of its reorganization, at least temporarily. And yet, how do we know this? We know this in the sense that, in an unconscious way, that feelings within institutional settings can be organized around the unrecognizable face of another, the audience, right, the spectator, in a way in which we could also try to reconstruct ourselves in anticipation of some change or variability that we don't know. Who are you? Who will you be? Will you or will you not kill me? And it, of course, could come back to our institutions and our critiques of them. The love that is proposed by an artwork is always partially lost in the field of art, in the institutional setting of art. Maybe that's just how it is when anything beyond the human is redesigned to enter the already built world. But I believe that the apparatuses of art, even its commercial markets and its storehouses of false autonomy, will continue to change as people rebel against the miserably narrow and singular love of humanity that these institutions house and protect. I'm hoping that the real addressee of art will still be like that strange passerby, seeing the spilled archive, surviving an emergency, exposed and helplessly facing the artwork's demand to be a non-human being. And I didn't get to the end at the same time, but that's the end. These are paintings and photographs of an American family that were fascists in the 1960s. You see him grow older. It's called Bakersfield, California, because that's where they lived. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, for this inspiring talk. I have one specific question, perhaps you already said it. Wilhelm Bohringer, Abstraction und Einfühlung, when was it written? In the 1910s?
1903 originally, but didn't sort of reach people, in particular abstract painter, Upside Down Landscape, who was most invested in his work earlier, whose name I've forgotten, 1908, 1910.
Okay.
But I'm not a scholar, but the interest that I have is this kind of idea of expressive psychology of the 19th century that predated him. Theodore Lipps was his professor, and Theodore Lipps is the one who initiated this idea that the artwork created an objectified condition through which empathy could be understood as almost a kind of social momentum. It's as having a certain kind of social momentum. It's kind of like interesting in the sense that we all sort of accept it in a way. We accept its, even though it's quite capricious, we accept its conceit, right? That somehow the artwork brings us closer to others, or closer to an other. But it's invented. I mean, I think maybe this was just new to me because of my lack of scholarship, but then this idea was invented. I mean, for the Renaissance painter, the idea that you are feeling Paoleo in his painting of the Annunciation is not what Paoleo had in mind. That you were not feeling him, right? But you were feeling some grander context of meaning.
I have another question, perhaps it's absurd, but it came into my mind. When you talked about your painting, I was wondering if you compare your relation to abstraction to, for example, Malevich, how would you position people to the black square of Malevich, for example?
In a sense, it's sort of the beginning, right? Because the idea to the suprematist idea that a picture or a non-picture would present a set of possibilities that would be, in a sense, perfect, right? Outside of any of the constraints, and therefore act as a kind of empty place, right, through which people would reorganize themselves, is maybe my beginning. Because when I talk about those group material exhibitions as being organized around ideas of democracy, this is a similar formal analogy or metaphor, right? The parliament is the empty room, right? The parliament is the place where political decisions are made, ideally in an agonistic context, right? Is where there's nothing there, right? And it's not so much that anything could, that anything could be said, or it invites everything to come on, right? And then to be figured out according to its emptiness.
Yeah, and also the constructivists had a lot to do with display, and different display, in terms of defining the space in which art takes place and the viewer as well.
Right. I mean, the early days of group material for me were overwhelmed with, in a sense, two narrations. One was early modernist ideas about reorganizing the viewer, not just the work of the early Soviet factographic or the suprematist abstraction, but also the ideas of Herbert Bayer in terms of like how to construct and build and direct audiences. The ideas of American designers, notions around the World's Fair. Like there was always in the early days this idea of like responding to or reorganizing the conditions of the spectacle. Because I went to school, in the 70s, and although most of my teachers were abstract expressionists, it's also kind of biographically something I'm realizing now that I'm kind of like returning to some of the things that they were really invested in. The momentum of students was the post-situationist institutional practice, right? It was to try to figure out how institutions could be remade by abusing them, using them differently, interrogating them, interfering into them. All the practices that we know from colleagues of mine like Merle Lademan and Euclides washing the steps of the museum to Andrea Fraser doing the docent tour. This is in a sense the sort of culture of the school in the 70s that I and others in group material were around. But to be clear about group material, not everyone in group material went to school. Like Julie Hall, my colleague for those 19 years, went to school after and was invested with ideas around changing art for reasons that have to do with, in a sense, being an artist. I bring this up, I'm sorry to go on and on about it, but because group material has become so historicized now, there's a lot of PhD people calling me and asking me for the way that these things happen, and Julie too, other group material members. Tim was involved early on, Tim Rollins, but left in 1985. Others are dead, so it's sort of like Julie Alt and I are the inheritors of this archive. And we did organize an archive, and it's in New York. If you go, it's at the Fales Library, which is part of NYU, and anyone can make an appointment and go through everything group material did, every photograph, every invitation, all our notes to each other, angry letters, flags, detritus, leftover things from AIDS timeline, free condoms. It's all in the boxes at the Fales Library. But the point I was trying to make is that because of this historical interest, it's dawning on me as you get older that in a way you have certain intellectual or analytic ideas about how your work developed, but there were also emotional contexts, which also have intellectual sources, historically intellectual sources, that you were in a sense carrying, not necessarily against your will, and not unknown completely, but not in a fully sort of publicly conscious way. I don't know if other people know what I mean, but I can give you an example. For instance, I had a teacher in the 70s, a man named Reuben Kadish. Reuben was an abstract expressionist, a close friend because they were in high school together at Jackson Pollock. And him and Jackson Pollock and, forgot his name, went to Mexico to work with David Siqueiros. David Siqueiros is a socialist realist / expressive muralist from Mexico who went to LA in the 20s to do public art projects that were part of the socialization of art happening around the New Deal economics of America between and previous to World War II. That investment in the idea of a kind of monumental public experience through a teacher of mine who didn't teach discursively the way we teach now, taught by presence. He worked, it was the atelier method. He worked and we worked. And you grunted and you made some mean comments and you sort of said beautiful things about other artworks to each other, but it was never a course in the sense that we would understand teaching to be a course. Anyway, long story, but those things are kind of in group material also in ways that now I realize they kind of don't fit with the idea of how institutional critique was historicized or is being historicized. But if you think about it, why did Andrea Fraser walk around crying in the museum anyway, right? If it wasn't really to save the aesthetic experience, the same aesthetic experience that those abstract expressionists were so transcendentally invested in, right? Why else would she do that, right? It wasn't to make the context of artistic and aesthetic possibilities only dogmatic and diagrammatic of social problems, right? It was to make the full range of aesthetic possible experiences, from the poetic to the epiphanic to an epiphany like possible, I think. She would argue with me because it's a Lacanian, which would be a psychoanalytic problem, but it's still something I think about. Why critique the museum if it isn't to save art? Because as you know, the museum has been the mausoleum of art since it was invented. Anyway, what else? Any other questions?
I want to ask you how you decide the scale of your paintings.
I make them small because it's a deficit. It's a disability. I can't do them bigger. I think I do it, and I'm sorry to sound unconscious about it because we're all supposed to be so conscious of how we make things, but I'm not really sure. It has to do with the way that I can still understand and invest a sensual experience of color and shape with the idea of a proposal that has to do with social life. It has to remain a model, right? It has to remain small enough to be repositioned, to be carried around. It's a hilarious thing too that now people, like I've done them for a while, but there was not necessarily that interest. We all know how the art world works. You do one big show, all of a sudden everybody's like, hey, who are you? I'm like, I'm who I was, you know, just doing the same old thing. Now, who are you? Oh wow, that's so interesting. Part of that rearrangement in public life as an artist has to do with the presence of the artist. That's the reason I bring it up, is because one of the reasons I make them small is I'm interested in them being reworked, right? So I would like other people to hang them. You know what I mean? Like I did that with other people's artwork when I was really young and wrote material. Some people got mad. They're like, hey, why'd you put my painting on the floor? And I'm like, don't you see? I'm putting you with John Hartfield, because even though you're doing this amazing thing about the history of fashion, it actually is about the history of fascism, right? Like there was a story, we were telling a story in the gallery, right? And I would love that to happen. And there's something about them being small. Like in a file cabinet, you know, like I could put them in a file cabinet, you could carry them in your bag and say, hey, let's put it here, try it here, try it here. And that kind of flexibility. But the irony is that they don't want that. So far, people are not so interested in that. They need you to be there. As Milan Kwan said so presciently 15 years ago, the currency of the artist is measured in your frequent flyer miles. Right? They want you to be there. Which is funny, particularly if you're making discrete objects like I am now, you know, and also with this, like we could Skype it. You can hang it, we'll Skype it. But that's what I want. I want to sort of Skype organize them somehow or something. Not, I mean, just like have them be translatable and rehangable. The big painting, the unified theory, seems more rigorous. Not to go on with history though, but that was the thing about remembering these old abstract expressionists. There was also a painter, Jake Berthaud, and he always said, I only like my paintings when there's a chair in front of them, right? And we do, we think of the institutional presentation of abstract expressionism as within these high ceiling, mega institutions with all this space around them. But when people first got them, right, they were in these low ceiling, high modernist skyscrapers in New York. The photographs are there with furniture in front of them. So when you saw Rothko, you saw it like this. You saw it with like this in front, you know, of the supposed transcendental color field, right? I'm not saying that Rothko was a relational artist, but it's something that I think was there that hopefully historians are also looking at. Like making a small painting and having someone put something in front of it or figure out what else to do with it. Sorry, long answer to a simple question. Anything else? The destruction of life is based on the idea of a state of emergency. We were all in it. That's why the New York Times is in the room. That's my experiment with the class, right? It's a state of emergency. There's nothing we can do. It's a state of emergency. We have to be in your phone. I'm sorry. We have to be in your phone. We have to be knowing where you are. I don't just want to like illustrate it in terms of its like most obvious oppressive conditions, but really emphasize in another way how that state of emergency has been designed for us as a part of the repressive apparatus of the state. Just period, right? It's, But then, catastrophes really do create sociality in a different way, right? There was a moment, it was like about 32 hours long. For people in New York, you know this, where after the towers came down, everybody was like, are you all right? Like, we all acted like we were from the South. When people in the South see each other, they say, how are you, right? Now, we were talking about, like, they may not really care, but there's a decorum of care. But there was this time where there was sort of like, are you okay? Everybody was like bringing cookies to people. People were trying to give blood. The hospitals were filled. People were organizing themselves. People were going over to other people and saying, wait a minute, are you okay? Because people are yelling at you because you have a different look. You don't look Anglo-European, right? Even the government, Bush on the second day had this meeting with imams and priests, right? This sort of idea of a collective, open moment where we're going to sort of re-examine even Bush foreign policy. Sure, he was talking about the war machine at the same time, but there was this kind of like reflective moment. That was my experience. Then there's the theory. There's a beautiful book, Living in an Emergency, Elaine Scarry. I think it's Elaine Scarry, where she writes about this historically. The way where the state apparatus did not organize people's understandings of a catastrophe towards institutional violence and repression, but where people sort of have to organize, they organize themselves around that sense of a disaster. But for me, the condition of the emergency also describes a maybe deeper, or at least broader, sense of identification with meaning or with other people, which is in a sense more psychodynamic, right? Which has to do with the fact that the catastrophe of love, right, is one in which you are always trying to compensate for some other past disaster or loss or separation, right? And it was the confluence of those two, right? The oppressive historical use of disaster by power and the kind of internal dialogue about those psychodynamics around love that made me want to show something different. I guess that's the best way to say it. What else? Yes.
How did you work the reenactments? Like, how did you work with the people who reenacted this picture from the New York Times?
I just made a lot of photographs. I did the photographers, like, you know, the fashion photographers technique. I had a lot of people. I had like 30 people, and I paid them for the day. I showed them the photograph. I told them a little bit about the event. They knew each other, and then we just kept trying. And I said, do it again. You know, do it again, harder, do it again, harder. It's like fashion, I guess, right? Or at least it's like that, what's the great film about the fashion photographer in the 60s?
Blow Up.
Blow Up, yeah. I mean, it wasn't that violent, but I mean, there's photographers here better at it than understanding it more than me, but it is, I just directed them.
Yeah, no, I was wondering if how much of an emotional impact it had on people, or if you directed them in a very physical kind of way, like, because this collapsing moment is quite strong, like collapsing into.
That's actually interesting, because although I didn't go into it that way, and I wanted to be objective, because I can be very emotional, and I don't like being emotional in public, they did become emotional. They became emotional just because of actually what happens when you try to hold someone else, because the other person is not holding their weight anymore, so you have to hold them. And it's even different than an embrace, because there. You feel the total, I did it too, you feel the total weight of their body. And the other person doing it has to give up a certain sense of a kind of context around the boundary of their body too. It's kind of more intimate than kissing in a way. If you could even kiss, like make out, you know, and you probably, well, that's what one of the people said. Like if we were kissing, it would be like a little bit easier. But for some people, it's just like, all right, come on, boom, pick you right up. They were fine. Everybody was a little different. What else? Yes?
So I'm still trying to understand the definition of abstraction as you're using it, and like the Bollinger stuff. And I guess I'm wondering how you would react to comparing it to escapism.
That's why I said I think it could be understood as reactionary.
Right, yeah, so I'm wondering if that, so it's not like, it wouldn't be offensive to call it escapist.
Well,
It's like,
yeah, it could be. I mean, I don't think.
or is fantasy a better, or is
Yeah,
that wrong?
sure. The difficulty is that I wish I had that intellectual command of this right now, but I don't. I think there's a difference between what we would understand, what we do understand in relationship to mass culture as escapist, right? And that we would understood, that what we could understand as withdrawn. And I don't mean withdrawn like withdrawn not emotional, I mean withdrawn as escaping from the conditions. I mean, the sort of like upbeat historical example, which is not, I've used before, but I have a little trouble now really trying to get a lot of these emotional narratives to fit into the different politics of separation versus integration. Remember, it was a big fight in the civil rights movement, right? Within the civil rights movement, integration or segregation. Segregation from the perspective of Afro-American identity, right? Like maybe you just need to leave us alone, right? Feminism also, CR, consciousness raising. Like how am I gonna know how fucked up they are if they're in the room? You know, they gotta get out of the room. We need to all go off by ourselves and talk amongst ourselves and be alone. But as I said, I have a little trouble claiming those political narratives because they're so great. And the paintings, and I'm not being humble, it's like a little, it's okay, you know, it's not that great, it's just okay. And when you align artistic projects with these like tremendously generative political histories, like consciousness raising within the feminist movement, second wave feminist movement, it appears quite pretentious to me. But, you know, Occupy was going on. It was interesting, you know, I'm not alone. There were other people saying, let's just get out of here. Let's get out of here, take this place, right? And see what it means to say, or see what it means to say to each other that we would rather not, right? I know that in terms of political scholarship, using Herman Melville's short story, Bartleby, where a petty bourgeois banker, scribe, he's a scribe. One day just says, I would rather not, and stops working. As an example, is also a little pretentious, but it was, that short story was discussed a lot in relationship to Occupy. And within Occupy, like many times when I was there, people were like, Bartleby, you know? It was great. I said, Bartleby forever, like, we would rather not. So yeah, escape. Escape. That's okay, I think. What else?
I would be curious to learn more. How do you perceive this tension that is there? The split in your work. You have the referentiality in the photos and the abstraction in relation to the photo. how do you develop it, and how do you see this tension? Is then the photo also being abstracted, or is it a translation, or is it a diagram of and then also maybe you can say how you pick the photos,
right,
and the context and then decontext.
Right, and then the other question is why those colors, right? Why is pink fascist, right? It's probably it's not. I don't want to make an argument for it being arbitrary, but I want to make the argument that its arbitrariness is part of an aesthetic experience that should be defended. So I'm a little bit still trying to work it out. When I make them, they usually come from a set of, I collect, I have archives of photographs that I collect and I hang on to them. In the beginning, like with the blue ones, it was a very distinct kind of mood project, right? Like to sort of try to get an emotional context and to make the shifting context of color represent the shifting relationships that you could have to history. So it's not really abstract, it's kind of semi-abstract. It's like, look at this form, see how this form could remake your relationship to that event, hence the title. With these newer ones though, like these rotten dark flags with these weird Nazis having Christmas, it's kind of happening from both directions. Though this work in particular, the photographs were found. I found all these photographs of these people. They could be still alive, I don't know. Yeah, I found them. Can you see him? There he is. So in a way, the pictures are an artificial insertion, right, into a dilemma around trying to understand a historical event. In this case, a whole history, in a sense, in the United States of whiteness, really of whiteness. My grandfather was in the John Birch Society. Most working class white people have a relationship either to the Klan, the John Birch Society, or the Nazi movement, American Nazi movement. Most of them, because of the complexity around working class culture. I mean, it doesn't get talked about a lot, but when you're in places where you can be honest with each other, and you're around other people who experienced those the white supremacy movement in the United States, i.e. black people, because it's still a movement. It's not a legitimate movement, but it's still a movement. You can sort of have those conversations. So yeah, these photographs, those kind of conversations, and then trying to take something else, something abstract, and in a sense, insert it. Does that insertion, that abstract insertion, have literal or representational relationships to the original photographic subject? Yes. It looks like a flag, has a certain kind of surface that you can look through one thing to another. You're looking through glass, or looking through one thing to another. It's an analogy for photography, the way you're looking through the sort of plan or framing of a photograph to another context of what is understood as truth value, right? So yeah, the photographs also could become then thought of as abstractions, but probably I'm not so interested in that. I want the photographs to actually represent a still historical event, and if anything, maybe it just occurred to me, I'm reinforcing the kind of like hegemony of the photograph, the power of the photograph, right? By saying it's this kind of absolute event into which then this other thing has to react. I don't know, it's speculative. What else? Dude, it's like 3. Can we go?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.